Now I'm recording. Good. Okay, so Stefanie, share your screen.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Per a conversation that we were having at the September meeting, I was asked to discuss my approach to a flipped classroom. So I figured I'd give you some sort of basic things that I do in my flipped classroom, and just some considerations that you might want to make as you might be exploring the idea of a flipped classroom for your own class. So this is my email address. I mean, I know you all know me already, but if you are ruminating about something after today and you wanted to ask me a question, my inbox is always open and I'm more than happy to support you as you go through the motions in your own classroom. So we'll start with a quick definition of what a flipped classroom is. And the most basic version that I could come up with here is that you're essentially changing the timing of the sequence of learning a new concept and applying it. So let's take a look at what this is like. In a traditional school format, and I grew up in this I grew up in the school format and I made it okay in life. So, if this is what you normally do, I don't want you to think that you're doing anything wrong or anything like that. But, and this is, I think, how I taught for the first, 12 to 13 years or so in my own Latin classroom. So in a traditional environment, you start out by introducing a new concept to your students in the classroom and you have them take notes on it. And one of the things that I started learning throughout my career is that note-taking is really, really hard to do. And I didn't realize that because I was a decent student, but I was a nerd. Like I love to learn. I love to be in the classroom. I love taking notes on stuff. But in conversations that were sort of unrelated to my own classroom, especially with special education teachers, I learned that note-taking is like this incredibly sophisticated skill that we expect that kids are just kind of able to pick up and run with. It involves pacing, the speed with which you, issue the new content and the students are writing it down in their notebooks. Your pacing is different because, we have this unfortunate burden because we know what all these concepts look like and how to render them. And these students are all learning it and looking at it for the first time. So our pacing tends to be based on our own understanding of the concept and not necessarily a first-time viewer's understanding of the concept. Note-taking is also relying on comprehension. Are the students really understanding what's on your PowerPoint and what they're writing into their notebook? And sometimes you get, a really excellent student who just kind of like, as they're copying it down, they get it. And they also understand too, how to look at what's on the PowerPoint, listen to what you're saying, and write down a blend of both of those things as well. If you think about it though, the audiovisual requirements that a typical, like grammar or history or mythology lecture, the kind of requirements that has on a student is actually quite extraordinary because the students have to be able to look at the slide that you're presenting, look at their notes. They have to be able to physically write down their notes while they are listening to you. And, most of us, because we're good presenters, we have sort of the broad strokes of what we're talking about on the slide, and we're elaborating for our class. And so the student has to be able to listen to us, but when we're talking, we're a few seconds ahead of where the student or what the student is writing. It's a really, really complicated process that I again, never had really paid much attention to because, and I don't want to boast, but I was pretty good at it. So I didn't realize how difficult it was from the opposite perspective. And then of course we always faced this crisis, like, well, what if a kid was absent? So you do this whole 45, 60-minute lesson, kids are taking notes the whole time and you're, covering the board end to end and you're erasing and you're giving all these, and then a kid is absent and then the kid shows up the next day and they're like, oh, what did I miss? And then, in your mind, you rewind 60 minutes of like a really good quality lesson and you're like, oh, you missed a lot. How do you really replicate that experience for a kid who didn't get it the first time around? And a lot of those kids will say to you, oh, I was absent yesterday, but don't worry, I got the notes from my classmate. And what they've essentially done is they've copied the notes from another student's notebook, which is half of the work, but they weren't really there for the unrolling of the concept. And, you know, especially in our specific discipline, we don't tend to just roll out a new concept that is completely absent to references to other things that they've learned. You know, language like math, et cetera, it's a cumulative subject. So you're using older concepts to teach newer ones, you know, so you might start out your lecture on the dative case by introducing what the accusative case was for a direct object and giving students a point of reference, and then you build on that when you're teaching the dative case. Or, you know, in your introduction to mythology lecture, perhaps you start with more of an understanding of what mythology is and what religious stories are, and then you sort of dive into classical mythology. That sort of thing is not always captured in a student's notes. That sort of thing is like a really organic experience that you want the kids to have for the first time. So if a kid is absent, they miss all of the magic that you put into, you know, unrolling that new concept, or whatever it happens to be. So these are all a whole host of factors that kind of go into challenging how we do traditional school. And, you know, to be fair, again, we all learned in this traditional schooling method because we didn't have a lot of other tools to support any other type of method. So this is what we know because that's all that we had back then. In this traditional school model, the students, you know, get this 45, 60-minute lecture in your classroom. And then normally what we do, and we've all done this, you know, I still sort of do it sometimes, then I send them home. And I say, okay, now you're going to apply this brand new concept to some sample sentences or some, you know, a sample story, or you're going to retell the story in your own words or whatever it is. And now the student has to like look at the notes and digest it all at the same time in a productive way and in a way that shows that they're doing a pretty sophisticated level of application and analysis. So you're essentially taking them from the bottom level of Bloom's taxonomy and asking them in a work assignment to do the top level in terms of evaluating how to put the infinitive in the right position with an indirect statement or something like that. And then 9 times out of 10, the students do this homework. They're not always successful. Sometimes they are, but then they come back to the classroom, and our understanding of whether or not the student gets it is based on the homework, not on the fact that they took the notes to begin with. And that can be problematic too, because students don't always authentically do their homework. Sometimes they work with other people. Sometimes they crib their homework completely. Sometimes they forget to do it. Or sometimes the kids just say, I didn't understand it, and so I didn't know what to do with the homework. So now my ability to understand whether they have grasped the concept is really stunted and limited by whether they did the homework and what they got correct or what they didn't get correct. So the flipped lesson model completely turns it around. It flips it. So with a flipped school model or a flipped lesson model, you are recording in some way, shape, or form that initial 45 to 60-minute grammar lesson. And you are allowing the student to take the same notes that they would have taken in the classroom at home. Now, this actually opens up a whole slew of possibilities for the student, because you're allowing them to pace the lesson and to pace the note-taking for what they are capable of doing. They can press pause on anything and make sure that they have everything written down to make sure they understand it. They can rewind it. They can go back and, you know, double check that they heard me say the thing in the right way. In terms of their comprehension, it's a little bit more measured, but we don't need to have 100% accuracy because of what happens in the second step of the sequence. As far as the flipped lesson goes, we can really cater to our students' audio and visual needs as well. I have a student who has legal blindness. And so the things that I'm writing on the board might not be visible to that particular student. But if I have couched all of that information into a video format, that student can use the adaptive software that the student has on their device to adapt it and to blow it up and to put it into a format that that student is now able to look at. For students who have ADD or other attention disorders, you know, a lot of those students, they take a bathroom break in the middle of the grammar lecture and they miss, you know, one of the key points, and just writing it down in their notebook doesn't really help to bridge that gap that they might have. So a student with an attentional disorder is able then to pause the video to go, you know, outside and throw a ball with, you know, their brother, and then come back. And now that they've been able to reset, now they're able to really acquire whatever the knowledge is. So you're able to fix a lot of the problems that are evident in the note-taking process itself. With the flipped learning model, then the students have now taken the notes at home, and now they come back to my classroom the next day, and that's where we apply things. And that's where I can see more authentically what students are grasping and what they're struggling with. And I can cater my secondary part of the instruction to the parts that they're struggling with or the parts that they're succeeding at. And so, you know, the student is able to participate in a class activity, they're able to participate in a group work thing. They have a lot more of a safety net if they're able to practice that new content in school with other people and with me observing them, but also, you know, on the spot to sort of evaluate where they are in terms of their acquisition of the new material. So essentially then, the three elements that we want to consider for a flipped lesson is making the homework a graded assignment for taking their notes. Also, this is a little bit old-fashioned for me, and I'm actually struggling with this a lot this year. My flipped lesson model has always been built on the idea that students are taking notes by physically writing them down in a notebook. And I require my students to have a notebook, and I require that, you know, that notebook then becomes almost like a Bible of Latin activity, whether it's history or grammar or anything like that. And I have them, I mean, I have them do this extensive thing with a table of contents, and they refer to things, they number their pages, and it really operates very nicely. However, now, like many of you, I only see the students 1 out of every 4 days in person, and some students are fully virtual. Students are used to doing school on their computer. So I have a lot more kids who are just taking notes on their computer, and I have a lot of reservations about that. The first year, on a weird side note tangent, the first year we went to using Chromebooks in our whole district, I tried to be very, like, you know, of the modern era with the student note taking. And I was asking my students in like May, so they'd had Chromebooks for about 7 months at this point. I was asking them to pull up their notes. And I had a child who pulled up a document that was just called Latin. And in that document entitled Latin was every note that he had ever taken. It was every activity he had ever done. It was every story he had ever worked with. It was anything that had to do with Latin. And it was, you know, 89 pages long. And I thought, oh my God, how do you find anything there? And that was one of the driving factors why I went to creating a more physical notebook where students are writing it. Obviously, there's a lot of brain research on my side that suggests that the brain remembers information that's written down with the hand rather than typed onto a computer. So I've been struggling with that this year. I don't think I have the answer for that. I do try to inculcate my students still with the idea of taking their physical notes on the topics in a notebook rather than on the computer. But that's something to wrangle with that, you know, that COVID-19 has dealt to us. Now, in this initial yellow circle here, I had spoken about homework grades for taking notes. I don't grade the quality of their notes. I just want them to take the notes. So it's a participation trophy. Did you take notes? Good, you get a grade for your homework. And it's really quite simple like that. However, moving to the red circle here, once in a while, and I mostly do this with my freshman level classes, I want to make sure that they are taking notes on the entire lesson and not just the major points that they think are necessary, because I think that students tend to think that they know enough and they can get by with just kind of like what they believe are the broad strokes of the lesson when they really miss a lot of the content that I've tried to deliver. So sometimes I'll give them a notes quiz where the quiz questions are literally taken directly from the presentation. So as long as they've written down all the stuff from the presentation, they get a 100 on the quiz. It's not hard. And it's not designed at all for application. It's not saying, okay, here was a lesson on the 5 forms of the infinitive. Now make this brand new infinitive into, perfect passive or something like that. It's just replicating exactly the content that I gave them. And it's really just a catch to make sure that they're taking as thorough notes as possible. That's also to say, I don't always do this. And with my freshmen, I start the year with a notes quiz and I put it in quotation marks because I want them to know that I have a certain expectation for what they're required to write. I don't grade it in the formal sense that it goes in the grading software, but it allows them to realize, oh, wow, she really wanted us to take like actual notes, and that helps to kind of build that awareness of what the expectations are, because students aren't always used to a flipped lesson or a flipped classroom. And so this helps me to teach them what the expectations are within this new system. So how I've done it, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of how you can flip your classroom. So I had presented on Screencastify last month. With Screencastify, I record my slideshow as though I'm teaching it live in a classroom. A quick note, and this kind of goes back a couple of slides too. When we first started talking about a traditional lesson, we said that a traditional lesson was like a class period, which could be between 45 and 60 minutes. On a very interesting note, if you take away the demand of writing on the board, the demand of changing your marker colors often to keep the kids their interest going, if you take away the time it takes to ask questions and have them answered, etc., you'll be actually surprised with how short your recordings actually are. With that said, I've attended some presentations on the flipped classroom, and I've heard a lot about structuring your lessons for the average attention span for a child. And even at the high school level, the average attention span suggests that you should do a video of no longer than 10 minutes. It seems like it's really short, I agree, but I guess students, based on brain research, they can handle 10-minute chunks of time on a video, but after that their minds start wandering, they start losing interest, etc. So my goal is always 10 minutes or less. Once in a while I slide in an 11-minute video and see what happens, and usually it's pretty fine. As I showed you last month, Screencastify allows you to save your video both in Drive as well as to upload it to YouTube. So because of Screencastify, I actually have a pretty healthy YouTube channel that has a number of different videos that I've uploaded. Now, one of the perks of flipped lessons as well as using using YouTube, one of the perks is that, number one, the students who were absent, they have the same access to the authentic lesson as they would have had in the classroom. So their presence is not required to have that magical experience. But this is also really good for when students take a test or a quiz on that same content in 1 week or 2 weeks or whatever the time frame is, because I give my students a study guide for the test, and I just hyperlink the video that's on YouTube, and I say, okay, well, part of your test is on creating participles. So remember, this was the original video, and I just link it right there so that the students have access to review it through original eyes or through review eyes, and they can kind of get that, that authentic experience one more time. In a traditional classroom model, we can't offer that to students because we were ourselves in that magical lesson once, and we can't even replicate it. We can't even, I mean, I don't even replicate my lesson exactly to a T from one period to the next. If I have two Latin 2 classes learning the same thing on one day, I learn from my first experience and I change it for the second, or I give different examples in both classes, or I joke around in different ways with both of the classes. So I'm not even the same necessarily in the same lesson if it's repeated, but the student will get that singular experience once, but then they have access to it in repeated fashion. So Crystal introduced us to Edpuzzle in the last meeting, and I use Edpuzzle a lot for flipped lessons as well, because Edpuzzle allows you to pause the video on purpose and make students sort of stop, think back to what they've learned or what they've seen. And sometimes you can make them apply it, or sometimes you can just use that opportunity to have students reflect on it and just write a quick summary. So you introduce the present active infinitive and the present passive infinitive, and then stop and say, okay, what's the difference? In your own words, tell it back to me. What are you getting from this experience? Edpuzzle is great because you can use Screencastify videos and manipulate them in Edpuzzle, but Edpuzzle gives you the entirety of the YouTube universe to manipulate with questions and stuff. So you can very easily flip your lessons using other people's grammar videos in an Edpuzzle format. So I know a lot of us know and love Ben Johnson's Latin tutorial videos. And he has really great and very straightforward instruction. He's got great graphics, very clear imagery on his videos, and they're pretty concise too. So they're a really great resource to use to, create a lesson from that without you having to go through all the motions of recording it on your own. One of the other advantages to Edpuzzle is that when you give an Edpuzzle assignment, if you give maybe just one or two application questions right off the bat, and I realize that sort of qualifies as it being like a homework application, but you might want to just try it in a safe environment where the kid is getting credit for the Edpuzzle and not credit for whether or not he has correct answers to the Edpuzzle questions. With that said, if you have a generous schedule of time, you actually can take a look at the students' responses to the questions that you've posed on Edpuzzle, and that's going to inform how you do that second step of instruction and application in your classroom. Maybe you have a worksheet planned, but then you realize, oh wow, these students really need help with like some of the basics of geography. Like I taught this whole history lesson about Caesar and his Gallic Wars, and they are not even sure where France is. So let me see if I can change my lesson at least for 10 minutes or so to go over some quick geography first before I get into what I really wanted to get into. The third tool that I've used for flipping my class is Pear Deck. And Pear Deck allows you to give a slideshow that has interactive slides that are embedded throughout. So you can give both static slides as well as dynamic slides. And you can create that slideshow in a self-paced manner, which again speaks to the students who have attentional issues, it speaks to the students who have audio-visual processing issues, or even audio-visual deficiencies from a physical standpoint. So you can allow them to pace themselves through the presentation and get the information that they need at a pace that's convenient for them. Pear Deck now allows you to embed audio on a variety of different slides so that you can show a pretty typical slideshow that you already have built, whether it's in PowerPoint or Google Slides. You can have all your transitions, you can have all the things that you are used to having, but with Pear Deck, it gives you the ability to do almost like a voiceover on the slide. And then the students get the oral experience of your presence within the lesson as well. And then of course with Pear Deck also has a similar advantage in that you can close the session and look at all the students' answers before you start class, so that you kind of gauge where your students are with respect to the new material before you see them. And that'll help to inform what you do with the lesson. So a few considerations when it comes to the flipped classroom. Absence is still a kind of issue, because if a student is absent when the flipped lesson homework is assigned, they come back into class the next day and you want to have them apply this new concept to some sample sentences or whatever the second part of the lesson is. And they're like, I don't have the notes. So, you know, you kind of have to make sure, sometimes what I'll do to try to avoid this is that if I know I'm doing a flipped lesson, I'll actually assign it like 2 or 3 days in advance instead of just like a 24-hour turnaround, so that if a kid misses it the first day, I have an opportunity to like catch up with him or her before it's like, you know, D-Day, before it's like application day. Another consideration to make though, and you know, this is a more serious one, and it goes back to the idea of the equity of technology. What type of access do these kids have to technology at home? Also, if you're assigning it as a homework assignment, you do want to consider the fact that students are often, you know, on the go after school. They're going to sports practices, they're going to their church youth group meeting, they're going to a Boy Scout project, whatever they might be doing, they might not have time. Whereas they might have had time for like a written assignment for homework, they don't have time to sit on Edpuzzle and watch a video. So again, this sort of lends itself to the idea of, you know, creating a longer term calendar for your flipped lesson where you assign it on Monday, but then you know in your mind that you're not going to do the work in class until Friday, so that you give them an opportunity to, you know, figure out their own schedule and find a time that works for them. But then of course, there's the idea of accessing the technology at home. You know, do they have their own device at home? Do they have the bandwidth? Do they have other siblings that they have to take care of after school, or other siblings who are also doing, you know, technology related things that, you know, their Wi-Fi might be down after school or something like that. So, you know, just a few considerations when you're looking at your personal student population and what you think you can assign to them and what you think is achievable. I would also say that consistency is really, really helpful when it comes to flipped lessons. Although I gave you some examples of 3 different tools that I use, I would find one that you're comfortable with and just use that pretty much across the board, because students need to have that idea that, okay, when my teacher says it's a flipped lesson day, I know that I have to go to YouTube and find her video, or I know that she's going to link the YouTube video to Classroom. Or if my teacher says it's a flipped lesson, I'm always going to have a self-paced pear deck to do. And that way, at least they also know with their own note-taking and organizing of their thoughts, if I say, okay, remember that flipped lesson that we did last week? They can say, okay, now I have to go find that Edpuzzle because that's where we did that flipped lesson, because that's where we always do flipped lessons. So you may want to think about what tool makes the most sense for you. And as I said, that list of tools that I gave you with examples, that is not at all an exhaustive list of things that you could do. And then the final thing you want to consider as you're moving forward in a flipped classroom model, how will you factor those flipped lessons into your gradebook? And I had alluded to this earlier. You know, do you want to give your kids a homework grade just for doing the notes? Do you want to give your kids a homework grade for, you know, a quiz that you give afterwards? You can evolve that as you go through the year too. You know, again, I find that with freshmen, you kind of have to be a little bit more supportive of their brand new high school experience early on in the year before you start really holding their feet to the fire about, you know, completing assignments and being graded upon them. Whereas if you were to implement this type of environment in your junior or senior level class, I think that you might be able to more easily transition to having those flipped lessons be graded in some way, shape, or form to make sure that they are fully accountable every single time for everything. So, you know, these are just questions that you might want to ask yourself as you're planning on flipping the classroom, or at least exploring what that might mean for you. I will add to one consideration that I didn't write here. Consider too your text series as well, and how your text series or your sort of general approach to your classroom might change how you do a flipped classroom model, in terms of what tool you're using, in terms of how long your lessons are, in terms of what sort of application things you're expecting of the students. I will share that I'm a Cambridge person through and through, so I'm not trying to necessarily convert you all to Cambridge Latin course, but I will say that the flipped classroom model became even easier to implement and sort of standardize throughout my classes when we switched to Cambridge, because of the fact that, Cambridge deals with grammar in a much less, how do I say, obtrusive way, I guess. The grammar itself does not dictate what the students do in a chapter. So having a flipped lesson as, a module that sort of exists on the side that we eventually look at, of course, and we apply to the stories that we're reading and, the model sentences and whatnot. I think that the flipped classroom model works really well within the Cambridge Latin curriculum, because of the way that the series itself deals with either historical lessons or mythological lessons or grammar lessons. All right, so thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Again, here's my email address. So at the end now, if you're like, oh my gosh, she said something and I have no idea what she meant by it, here's my email address again, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, one thing can you hear me?
Yep.
We can.
I've been doing the flipped classroom for, I guess, a decade now. And of course, I do very little language. I used to do Greek, but I do mostly classical civilization courses, humanities courses. And my impulse for it was when we had this teaching fellows program, the universal problem we have is that no students are ever prepared for their lecture. So what is the point of lecturing on Virgil's Aeneid when nobody's read anything? So from the perspective of non-language courses, to me, it's good because they can read it when they're prepared. Okay. And the other thing is that I was always inspired by, let's see, the science program. So you have all the bells and whistles. You can show Aeneas's ship going from Sicily to Italy and whatever. And so you can put all those multimedia bells and whistles in there. Plus, you can insert movies. So what I do is I create a PowerPoint, and then I film myself doing it through QuickTime with a voiceover narration, and then I import it into iMovie and massage it and add soundtrack. Like I always put a bit of Bach at the beginning. It's like, something very pretentious, and I found it good because so many of my students are not prepared. When you have an 8:30 class and nobody's even there, a lot of students just prefer to do their homework at 3 in the morning or whatever. And, it does have a problem, but they can do it at their own pace. And that's the only trouble I found, is that because I give them so much and because I don't give them a very firm deadline, sometimes the students try to do all the homework of a semester in like 2 weeks, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point too with the 8:30 a.m. class. Although you might have a stellar lecture planned, having kids who are awake enough to really appreciate what's going on beyond just writing stuff down, they're dozing sometimes too, because our schools are starting much earlier than their bodies are really prepared to function at. So you might have something that you really want them to understand and comprehend and apply and things like that. But if they're not mentally there because of, a sleep issue or whatnot, you're right. It definitely falls on deaf ears. So give it to them when they're alert at 2 a.m. or whenever they do their homework, which is of course completely inexplicable to us, but it makes more sense for them to do it in a schedule that works for them versus my schedule or the bell schedule that the school gives.
Also, too, I've augmented some of my courses with online discussion groups, so that if they do want to have questions, not all asynchronous, but I have like 10 discussion modules for my semester, so I can always put out questions, so we can, leading questions, so they can, build on it. But I really like your pair deck thing. I wish the idea of stopping, because that sounds a really good thing, saying, okay, what did I say ideology was? And to make sure I got that concept before I build on that.
Yeah. I feel our middle schools do a really good job of like teaching the kids how to take notes, which is wonderful. But then by the time we get to the high school, they become like automatons. Like I will write down every word that is on the board and I don't care what it says. I'll just write it all down without truly realizing what exactly they're writing down. And so I think that some of these tools give students the opportunity to just pause and say, what did I write down? What am I even talking about here? You know, because there are a lot of times like you can give kids a bunch of notes and then you ask them a question and they'll just look at their notes and they're like, I don't know. What did she just say that's pertinent to this question? Because they're well trained to write down everything that's on the slide, but they're not quite as hip in their student maturity level to understand how to make your question work within the bounds of what they've just written down.
Stephanie, can I ask, so we all have that student who, no matter what you try to do with them, never does homework. How do you handle that, especially in this environment with, then I can foresee, depending upon the student, depending upon the family, even, the parent then complaining and saying, well, she says you're not teaching them in class, the concepts, she's not doing well for that. How do you negotiate it with that student who just does not do stuff on their own like that?
That's a great question. I fortunately haven't had to deal with that too much. But sometimes if it becomes a habitual thing, sometimes I'll just pull the student out of the first 10 minutes of class. I know that they're going to show up again, not having notes, not being prepared. So I'll say, okay, fine, you can take 10 minutes of class time. Go listen to my video in the hallway, go take your notes now, and then come back and do 50% of the application process that we're doing in class, because it's more important for me that they get the content. And if it means that they don't get as much, production and application time, it's a sacrifice that I think almost has to be made. In the case of a parent, though, if a parent were to say like, well, you're not actually teaching or something like that, I would be happy to just email a parent with a list of all the YouTubes and say, I am teaching, your child is just not in the classroom when the teaching is happening. I would not personally hesitate to defend this model of instruction to a parent rather, because I think that it has enough value and it has enough worth that, I would love to be able to just give the parent all the resources and say, well, these are the lessons that the student has done, and these are the lessons that I've created for the student. And, instead of doing the class activity that we would have done as a homework assignment, I just swapped them. And, your student has done a lot of learning in the classroom, but it's building on what he has done for homework. So yeah, it is a slippery slope though, because there are kids who are just habitually like not homework people, not because they don't have tech, just because they don't like doing stuff outside the classroom. And that is hard. And I do think about that a lot when I plan for this sort of environment.
And can I ask one more question? And this is specific more to what I'm dealing with. So if I were to do this flipped classroom right now for this year, my school has decided to be understanding of the environment that students are in, they have an extra day to do the homework. So would you have to, so they can turn in homework late without a penalty.
Mhm.
So in your type of, with the flipped classroom, then would you be kind of actually giving them stuff several days in advance?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would theme the system per se. So if I knew that I was giving them a homework assignment on Monday, but I knew that I wasn't going to cover it until Friday, I would make it due on Thursday. And give everybody a grade for having done it Thursday, and then just show up to class and, oh, well, guess we're not going to have time for that today, but we'll do it tomorrow, and then the kid who has the extra day, but you haven't lost any time because in your, long-term plan. And it does require you being like a super good planner though. And I know that that's not always easy, especially when we have so many moving parts and different days in school versus out of school. So, if you can do it, I would just do it like that, make an arbitrary due date that's not necessarily when you're actually going to be covering it in class then.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other questions? Well, Stephanie, thank you once again for stepping up and giving us such a wonderful presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so November 14th, Ray Capra on Malta. Does anybody have any last things to say? Thank you all so much for coming. See you in November.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you
Bye-bye.
then.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Kathy,
you,
if you
Stephanie.
have a minute, I'll chat with you for a second.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I just earlier when we were talking, I couldn't, I was trying to unmute to answer when you said that I was taking the minutes and it wouldn't unmute. I don't know. Sometimes things just freeze.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It happens to me.
So-
Oh, hold it. Let me stop